Another complexity of this situation of the big picture that I'm painting is that the managers and senior personnel running institutions aren't really well placed to manage the change necessary to use technology well and introduce ICT into the teaching program. And this was a policy report done 5 years ago by the European Open and Distance Learning Committee, Liaison Committee. I would think that that situation still applies today, that we've got a challenge for the leaders of institutions to fully comprehend how best to achieve this synergy of using technologies well in addition to face-to-face learning. So I would like now to just talk about the technology pedagogy context. And those of you who have heard me speak before or are aware of some of my papers would be aware that I wrote about 5 generations of distance education, starting with the correspondence model and moving through a whole variety of different technological applications. So as the technology changed, distance education institutions embrace the technology. They still do. And they're always at the leading edge of using technology. So when I thought about blended learning, I thought, where does blended learning fit into a distance education technology? And so instead of the first generation, which I refer to as correspondence model, I've put face-to-face teaching as what I call Generation Zero, because we've had that for hundreds of years, even before we had the printing press. So if we look at some of the characteristics of chalk and talk, I've described it as that we have no real flexibility for the student. We may not have highly refined materials, but we have high quality interaction. At least that's the theory. But the institutional variable cost of providing face-to-face teaching is quite expensive, because we need big lecture theatres like this, or we need tutors for every 20 students, every 30 students. So the variable cost of supporting students is still quite high with face-to-face teaching. With correspondence model, which was the first generation of distance ed, we added flexibility to that. So as you'd be aware, you have flexibility of time, of place, of pace. You tend to have highly refined materials to work with, but the interactivity is probably somewhat limited when the correspondence model was dominant. And the institutional variable costs were quite expensive and became more expensive as technology became more available to consumers. So as the students started buying audio tapes, videotapes and the like, the tendency was for institutions to use those technologies and to increase the variable costs, because we'd send out bigger and more complex packages. So we still have flexibility, we have more highly refined materials, but we have not so much interactivity, but the costs are tending to increase. The more students we get, the higher the costs. Whichever way we think about the economics of higher education, whether we're face-to-face teaching or whether we're purely online, you still have to manage the fixed costs of the infrastructure, courseware design and the like, and the variable costs, which tend to vary. The more students you get, the higher the costs. So this is a challenge for all of higher education as we move from an elite system to mass higher education towards universal higher education. The tele-learning model complicated things in the 80s primarily, where we started having live broadcasts through television or through video conferencing. And again, the technology was used significantly, but the cost structure changed. So the infrastructure costs were quite high. You lost flexibility. You didn't necessarily get the large number of students that you wanted. So you sacrifice some of the flexibility for the interaction, the face-to-face interaction. Once the internet arrived and started to be used for higher education, then we had more of the benefits potentially. We had both interactivity and flexibility, except where we needed to provide support from staff for students. So what we tended to have in institutions was that for every 20 or 30 students, you need another tutor. So that's why I've highlighted the institutional variable costs not really differing. They're still rising because we need more staff when we have more students. But I think with the technology that's emerging now, 5th generation Mark I, we've got capacities for using repositories, for storing and downloading materials, and we start to have the opportunity to bring the cost of delivery down and still have high quality flexibility, high quality interactivity. And I just want to highlight one system that did that we introduced at USQ in 2002. And this was to help students gain access to administrative or policy procedural questions about the way that the institution ran its degree programs. So we introduced a web self-service repository which reflected the common questions that students tended to ask time and time again. So these were based on authentic questions and authentic answers, and we introduced a self-service opportunity for students to find out what they wanted. And it was only if there wasn't an answer in the database that students then involved a staff member. Now, when we introduced this, people said that students would still pick up the telephone or they would still come to the desk and they wouldn't use self-service. Now, that hasn't proven to be the case. So the last time we did a major review of this, which is more or less embodied in the system now, this shows you the number of student visits to the site. And when we looked at the costs associated with that, we used the Gartner benchmark for managing the variable costs of customer contacts. And web self-service came in much more cheaply than face-to-face or phone contact. These are the same challenges that face blended learning. Face-to-face teaching will inevitably cost more than using the technology in an efficient way. So that analysis that we did showed that students were still emailing and still phoning, but there was a tremendous usage of the self-service system. We believe we saved $1 million and still provided high-quality support because students got an answer when they required it immediately. So using that as an example, I still believe that if we can use the technology well in blended learning, we can provide students with high-quality tuition and support and still have the potential to reduce the student fee. So that, I see, is the challenge in a way for higher education to increase access.